In 2010, Libya had the highest standard of living in all of Africa. Free healthcare, free education, subsidized housing, almost no national debt. By 2011, that same country was being bombed by the most powerful military alliance on earth, in the name of protecting its people. What Western media called a humanitarian intervention had almost nothing to do with humanitarian concerns, and everything to do with something Gaddafi was about to launch: a gold-backed African currency. That currency would have freed an entire continent from financial dependence on the dollar and the euro. It threatened trillions of dollars in Western financial control. This is the story of how that threat was eliminated, and what was left behind when the bombing stopped. To understand what was destroyed in 2011, you must first understand what Libya actually was. Not the caricature, the reality. Libya sat on the largest proven oil reserves in Africa. Under Gaddafi, that oil wealth was distributed in ways almost no other oil-rich nation has matched. Healthcare was free for every Libyan citizen. Education was free from primary school through university, including study abroad programs funded by the state. Newly married couples received financial assistance to buy their first home. Electricity was free for many residential consumers. Libya's literacy rate rose from around 20% before Gaddafi to over 87% under his government. One of the most dramatic education transformations in African history. The UN's Human Development Index ranked Libya as having the highest standard of living on the entire African continent. This is not Gaddafi propaganda. These are the UN's own published statistics, figures that Western governments rarely mentioned once the bombing campaign began. None of this means Gaddafi's Libya was a democracy. It was an authoritarian state with no free press, no political opposition, and a documented history of human rights abuses. Political dissidents were imprisoned. Critics disappeared. Gaddafi ruled through fear as much as through generosity. Both things are true simultaneously. What made Libya different from other authoritarian oil states was not the absence of repression. It was the presence of broad-based prosperity that repression usually prevents. Libya had almost no national debt. Its sovereign wealth fund held over $60 billion in foreign assets, wealth accumulated for the Libyan people's future. Compare this to neighboring countries where oil wealth disappeared into the pockets of elites while populations remained in poverty. Libya was the exception, not the rule. Gaddafi often spoke about wanting Libya's model to expand beyond its own borders, to fund African development and reduce the continent's dependence on Western financial institutions. This ambition would eventually crystallize into a specific, concrete plan. A plan that terrified the institutions that had profited from African dependency for over a century. But before that plan could be understood, you need to understand the man who created it, and the decades-long journey from revolutionary to rehabilitated statesman that preceded it. It is a journey that took him from being one of the West's most hated enemies to one of its most courted partners, and back to enemy again in a matter of months. September 1969. A 27-year-old army officer named Muammar Gaddafi led a bloodless coup against Libya's King Idris. King Idris had allowed Western oil companies, predominantly American and British, to control Libya's oil with minimal benefit flowing back to ordinary Libyans. One of Gaddafi's first major acts was nationalizing Libya's oil industry, taking control away from foreign companies and putting it in Libyan government hands. This immediately made him an enemy of the same Western oil interests that had backed coups against similar leaders in Iran and Guatemala in previous decades. Gaddafi published his political philosophy in a short book called The Green Book, a mix of socialism, Arab nationalism, and his own idiosyncratic theories of direct democracy. Throughout the 1970s and 1980s, Gaddafi positioned himself as a sponsor of anti-colonial and anti-Western movements across Africa and the Middle East. This included funding groups that Western governments labeled terrorist organizations, making Libya one of the most sanctioned states on earth throughout the Reagan era. In 1986, Reagan ordered airstrikes on Libya in retaliation for an alleged Libyan-sponsored bombing in Berlin. One of the targets was Gaddafi's own residence. Then came Lockerbie. In December 1988, a bomb destroyed Pan Am Flight 103 over Scotland, killing 270 people. Libya was eventually held responsible. For over a decade, Libya was treated as a global pariah state, under crushing UN sanctions, isolated from international trade and diplomacy. Then, remarkably, in the 2000s, everything changed. Gaddafi formally accepted responsibility for Lockerbie, paid compensation to victims' families, and dismantled Libya's weapons programs. Western leaders who had once called him a mad dog began visiting Tripoli. Tony Blair embraced him in the desert. Sanctions were lifted. Oil contracts were renegotiated. By 2009, Gaddafi was being courted by the same Western nations that had bombed him 23 years earlier. He addressed the United Nations General Assembly. He was treated as a legitimate statesman. Major Western corporations, oil companies, defense contractors, infrastructure firms signed billions of dollars in deals with Libya during this period of rehabilitation. It seemed for a brief period that Gaddafi had successfully transformed from revolutionary outcast to respected international partner, but underneath this diplomatic rehabilitation, Gaddafi was developing a plan that would prove far more threatening to Western interests than anything he had done as a younger revolutionary. For decades, Gaddafi had watched African and Arab nations remain economically dependent on Western currencies: the dollar, the euro, and in former French colonies, the CFA franc. The CFA franc in particular represented one of history's most enduring colonial financial arrangements. 14 African nations using a currency whose value was controlled by France. Those 14 nations were required to deposit a portion of their foreign currency reserves directly into the French treasury. Decades after independence, this arrangement continued. Gaddafi proposed something radical: a single African currency backed by gold that would free the continent from this dependency entirely. He called it the gold dinar. The plan was for African and Arab oil-producing nations to sell their oil in gold dinars instead of dollars. This was not a fringe idea. Gaddafi had pledged $30 billion from Libya's own reserves to help launch the currency. He had garnered support from numerous African heads of state. He also proposed an African central bank, an African monetary fund, and an African investment bank. Institutions that would have made the World Bank and IMF irrelevant to the continent. Economists estimated that a successful gold dinar, backed by African gold and oil reserves, could have become one of the most stable currencies in the world. If oil-producing African and Arab nations had shifted even a portion of their oil sales to gold dinars instead of dollars, the impact on dollar demand would have been significant. This was happening at the exact same historical moment that Iran, as covered extensively elsewhere in this series, was also working to escape dollar dependency. Saddam Hussein had attempted something similar in 2000, announcing Iraq would sell oil in euros instead of dollars. He was overthrown 3 years later. French intelligence officials reportedly described Gaddafi's gold dinar plan as a threat to the financial security of not just France, but the entire West African franc zone. A 2011 email, later released through Hillary Clinton's State Department FOIA disclosures, explicitly discussed Gaddafi's gold dinar plan as a significant factor in considering intervention in Libya. The email noted that this plan was a threat to the French franc zone and that French President Nicolas Sarkozy had specific reasons, beyond any other stated motive, to want Gaddafi removed. This was not a humanitarian intervention being planned. This was a financial threat being assessed by the exact people who would later justify the war on humanitarian grounds. Within months, an opportunity to remove that threat, wrapped in a humanitarian justification the world would accept without question, arrived from an unexpected direction. December 2010. A Tunisian street vendor named Mohamed Bouazizi set himself on fire in protest against police harassment and economic desperation. His death ignited what became known as the Arab Spring, a wave of protests against authoritarian governments that spread across Tunisia, Egypt, Yemen, Syria, Bahrain, and Libya. In Tunisia and Egypt, decades-long dictators fell within weeks. The world watched in genuine astonishment as seemingly permanent regimes collapsed almost overnight. In February 2011, protests began in the Libyan city of Benghazi, a region with long-standing grievances against Gaddafi's government, dating back decades. Unlike Tunisia and Egypt, the Libyan protests quickly turned violent. Armed groups formed, and within weeks the country was experiencing a genuine civil war. Gaddafi's government responded with significant force. There were genuine, documented atrocities committed by his forces during this period. Western media coverage at the time amplified claims, some accurate, some later found to be exaggerated or fabricated, of Gaddafi planning a massacre in Benghazi. Claims that Gaddafi's forces were using mass rape as a weapon of war, and that mercenaries from sub-Saharan Africa were being deployed against civilians circulated widely. Amnesty International later investigated many of these specific claims and found no credible evidence supporting several of the most widely circulated atrocity stories. This does not mean Gaddafi's forces were innocent. It means the specific narrative used to justify international intervention was, in significant parts, manufactured or exaggerated. On March 17, 2011, the United Nations Security Council passed Resolution 1973, authorizing a no-fly zone over Libya to protect civilians. The resolution explicitly excluded foreign occupation forces. It authorized protecting civilians. It did not authorize regime change. Russia and China abstained from the vote rather than veto it, explicitly because they had been assured the operation would be limited to civilian protection, not regime change. Within days of the resolution passing, NATO airstrikes began targeting not just defensive positions, but Gaddafi's command structure, his residences, and his forces broadly. Russian Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov stated publicly that the operation had gone far beyond what the resolution authorized, calling it a fundamentally different operation than what had been approved. What had been authorized as a narrow humanitarian intervention to protect civilians had, within weeks, become a full-scale regime change operation. And everyone involved knew it. To understand how a no-fly zone became a regime change war, you have to understand who was actually driving the intervention behind the scenes. U.S. Secretary of State Hillary Clinton became the most prominent and aggressive advocate within the Obama administration for military intervention in Libya. She was reportedly more hawkish on Libya than Defense Secretary Robert Gates, who initially expressed significant skepticism about the wisdom of military intervention. French President Nicolas Sarkozy was the most aggressive Western leader pushing for intervention, flying French jets into action before formal NATO command structures were even established. French intelligence assessments connecting Gaddafi's gold Dinar plan to the French franc zone threat have already been established. Sarkozy had financial motives that were never publicly disclosed. There were also allegations, never fully resolved, that Gaddafi had funded Sarkozy's 2007 election campaign, and that Sarkozy had personal reasons to want him removed and discredited. British Prime Minister David Cameron also pushed aggressively for intervention, partly driven by domestic political considerations, following criticism over his handling of earlier Middle East policy. None of the three Western leaders most responsible for driving the intervention publicly mentioned the gold dinar threat as a factor. All three spoke exclusively about protecting civilians. Major oil companies, and including French company Total and various American firms, had extensive interests in Libya's oil fields and stood to benefit from a change in government. Within months of NATO's intervention beginning, Libya's rebel National Transitional Council signed oil agreements with French and other Western companies. Agreements explicitly tied to the support they had received. A senior rebel official confirmed in interviews that France had been promised 35% of Libya's oil production in exchange for its military support during the conflict. This single confirmed statement transforms the entire narrative, from humanitarian intervention to a transaction where military support was traded for resource access. The bombing campaign that followed was extensive. NATO conducted over 9,600 strike sorties against Libyan targets over 7 months. Libyan government claims of civilian casualties from these strikes were largely dismissed by Western media at the time. Independent investigations later confirmed significant civilian deaths. Human Rights Watch documented at least 72 civilians killed in 8 NATO airstrikes that it investigated. Strikes the alliance claimed were targeting only military objectives. By August 2011, Tripoli had fallen to rebel forces backed by NATO air power. Gaddafi fled, and what happened to him next would become one of the most disturbing moments of the entire conflict. Declassified State Department emails later revealed the extraordinary degree to which Hillary Clinton relied on an unofficial advisor for intelligence and policy guidance on Libya. That advisor was Sidney Blumenthal, a longtime Clinton family confidant who had no official position in the State Department or any government intelligence role. Blumenthal was simultaneously providing intelligence memos to Clinton on Libya, while also having a financial relationship with a private intelligence firm that had business interests connected to the conflict. The emails show Blumenthal repeatedly pushing for military intervention, often based on information of questionable reliability, treated by Clinton's office as serious intelligence. Some of the intelligence Blumenthal provided concerned Gaddafi's gold reserves and financial assets, information that would later prove relevant to who benefited from the regime's collapse. Throughout 2011, Clinton's emails reveal a State Department deeply engaged not just in humanitarian planning, but in calculating the economic and resource implications of regime change. On October 20, 2011, Gaddafi was captured by rebel forces near his hometown of Sirte after his convoy was struck by a NATO airstrike. What happened next was filmed on multiple mobile phones by the rebel fighters who captured him. The footage is graphic and widely available. Gaddafi was beaten, sodomized with a bayonet, and ultimately shot to death by the fighters who had captured him. A brutal, extrajudicial killing with no trial, no due process, no accountability. Within hours of Gaddafi's death being confirmed, Hillary Clinton gave a television interview. When informed of his death, she laughed and said, "We came, we saw, he died." That clip, her laughing response to a man's brutal extrajudicial killing, became one of the most replayed and criticized moments of her entire political career. Defenders argued the laugh was a nervous reaction, not genuine amusement at violence. Critics argued it revealed the casual disregard with which the entire operation had been conducted. Whatever the laugh meant personally, what is not contested is what followed for Libya. The country that NATO claimed to be saving immediately began to disintegrate. There was no post-war reconstruction plan, no transitional governance framework with teeth, no security infrastructure to manage the hundreds of armed militias that had formed during the conflict. Compare this to the extensive, though flawed, reconstruction planning that at least nominally existed for Iraq and Afghanistan. For Libya, there was almost nothing. The country that had the highest standard of living in Africa was about to descend into a chaos that would make it almost unrecognizable within a few short years. With Gaddafi dead and his government destroyed, Libya faced a fundamental problem that nobody outside the country had adequately planned for. Who would actually govern it? Gaddafi's 42-year rule had eliminated all independent political institutions. There were no political parties, no civil society organizations, no experienced bureaucracy outside his personal network. Hundreds of armed militia groups, some formed for the revolution, others opportunistic, controlled different territories, different oil facilities, different cities. Within 2 years, Libya had effectively split into competing governments, one based in Tripoli, another in the east, each claiming legitimacy, neither controlling the entire country. The country's oil production, once a source of broadly shared national wealth, became a prize fought over by competing factions, each trying to control export terminals and revenue. Libya's once substantial military arsenal, including significant stockpiles of weapons, flowed out across the region, fueling conflicts in Mali, Syria, and across the Sahel. Terrorist organizations, including groups affiliated with both al-Qaeda and later ISIS, established footholds in territory that the collapsed Libyan state could no longer control. ISIS controlled the Libyan coastal city of Sirte, Gaddafi's own hometown, for over a year, implementing its brutal governance model on Libyan soil. Libya's healthcare and education systems, once free and broadly accessible, collapsed in many regions as the state's capacity to fund and administer them disintegrated. Hundreds of thousands of Libyans were internally displaced. Hundreds of thousands more fled the country entirely, joining the broader migration crisis affecting Europe. The Economic Wealth Fund that had held over $60 billion for the Libyan people's future was frozen by Western governments during the conflict and has never been fully returned to Libyan control. Significant portions of those frozen assets have reportedly been managed, invested, and in some cases allegedly mismanaged by the very Western financial institutions tasked with safeguarding them. Successive United Nations-backed peace processes have attempted to reunify Libya's government. Each has failed to produce lasting stability. Today, more than a decade after Gaddafi's death, Libya remains divided between competing governments, regularly experiences renewed armed conflict, and has never recovered the stability or prosperity it once possessed. The gold dinar plan that may have triggered the intervention died with Gaddafi. No African nation has since pursued a comparable challenge to dollar dominance on the continent. But the most disturbing chapter of Libya's collapse was not the political fragmentation. It was something that emerged from the chaos that almost nobody in the West wants to discuss today. In 2017, CNN broadcast undercover footage that shocked the world. Footage of an open slave auction taking place in Libya. Black African migrants, people who had traveled through Libya hoping to reach Europe, were being bought and sold as laborers openly for as little as $400 each. These were not isolated incidents. International organizations, including the UN's own migration agency, confirmed the existence of an organized slave trade operating within Libya's borders. Libya, under Gaddafi, despite all its other documented human rights problems, had never had this specific horror. An organized, open market for buying and selling human beings. The collapse of central state authority created the exact conditions: lawless territory, armed militias, desperate migrants with nowhere else to go, that allowed this trade to flourish. Libya remains the primary departure point for migrants attempting the deadly Mediterranean crossing to Europe, a crossing that has killed tens of thousands of people since 2011. European governments, while publicly condemning the human rights abuses occurring in Libya, have simultaneously funded Libyan militias and Coast Guard units to intercept and return migrants, to the same conditions being condemned. Today, Libya is effectively divided between two rival governments: the Government of National Unity in Tripoli and a rival administration in the east aligned with military commander Khalifa Haftar. Russia has established a significant military presence in eastern Libya, supporting Haftar's forces, turning Libya into another front in the broader geopolitical competition between Russia and the West. Turkey has supported the rival Tripoli government, meaning Libya now hosts proxy forces from multiple foreign powers fighting for influence over a country that was once self-sufficient and stable. Libya's oil production, once a source of broadly shared prosperity, now frequently shuts down for months at a time due to blockades by competing factions seeking leverage in political negotiations. Per capita income in Libya has fallen significantly since 2011. The free healthcare and education systems that once made Libya the envy of the African continent have deteriorated dramatically in many regions. The country that the UN's own Human Development Index had ranked highest in Africa in 2010 has fallen dramatically in those same rankings in the years since. None of the Western leaders who championed the 2011 intervention have faced any meaningful accountability for the catastrophic outcomes that followed their stated humanitarian mission. Hillary Clinton went on to run for President of the United States in 2016. Nicolas Sarkozy faced unrelated corruption charges years later, but never faced consequences specifically tied to the Libya intervention. Libya stands today as the starkest possible illustration of what happens when a wealthy, stable nation is destroyed for reasons that were never honestly stated to the public that paid for the bombs. Libya is not an isolated story. It is one chapter in a pattern that spans decades, a pattern this entire series has documented piece by piece. In 2000, Saddam Hussein announced Iraq would sell its oil in euros instead of dollars. By 2003, he had been overthrown in an invasion justified by weapons of mass destruction that were never found. In 2009, Gaddafi began seriously advancing his gold dinar plan to free Africa from dollar dependency. By 2011, he had been overthrown in an intervention justified by humanitarian concerns that were significantly exaggerated. Iran has spent over a decade building alternatives to the dollar, trading in yuan, rubles, rupees, while facing escalating sanctions and the persistent threat of military action that this series has covered extensively. Three leaders, three challenges to dollar dominance. Two are dead. One remains under continuous threat. The pattern is not a coincidence. It is a documented feature of how the petrodollar system maintains itself. This does not mean every leader who challenges the dollar will be overthrown. It means that leaders who do so face a documented historical pattern of facing intervention, justified by other stated reasons. The countries that have successfully maintained alternative currency arrangements, Russia and China most prominently, have done so by possessing nuclear weapons and military capabilities that make direct intervention prohibitively costly. This suggests an uncomfortable conclusion. The dollar's global dominance is ultimately enforced not just through economic logic, but through the credible threat of military consequences for serious challengers. BRICS nations, as covered extensively in this series, are now attempting a coordinated collective challenge to dollar dominance specifically because individual challenges have historically been crushed. The logic is straightforward, and it is far more difficult and costly to militarily confront a coalition representing 40% of the world's population than it is to overthrow a single leader. Whether this collective strategy succeeds where individual challenges failed is one of the defining geopolitical questions of the coming decade. What is certain is that Libya's destruction served a purpose far beyond what was ever honestly communicated to the publics, whose tax money funded the bombing campaigns. An entire nation's prosperity, stability, and social achievements were sacrificed, not primarily to protect civilians, but to eliminate a threat to a financial system that benefits a small number of nations at the expense of many. The slave markets of Tripoli, the divided government, the foreign proxy armies, the collapsed healthcare system, all of this is the documented price of protecting a currency system that most ordinary Libyans never benefited from being protected. History will eventually have to answer the question of who is accountable for this outcome. So far, nobody has been. And as the dollar's global dominance continues to face new challenges from new directions, the question Libya leaves us with is simple and urgent. Who is next, and what will the world be told the real reason was? This video does not argue that Gaddafi was a hero or that his government was just. It argues that the stated reason for his overthrow was not the actual reason, and that the difference matters enormously. Understanding the actual mechanisms of global power, who benefits, who pays, and what is never said publicly, is the only way to make sense of a world that often defies its official explanations. Wealth history, where the past explains everything you see today.